Hello everyone, thanks for coming. The title of this talk is Revolutionary Activity. So what I'm basically going to argue is that the party should support the principle of class-wide trade unionism and direct action. And I'm going to go into my main thesis soon. Before I do, I just want to make something sort of clear, just so that people don't think that I'm saying something that I'm not saying. So what I want to say first is that I think that everything that the party does, it should do, and this isn't a criticism of anything that the party does do at the moment. So that is to say that if we want socialism, we need a party that stands for socialism and only for socialism. Two, we need a party that propagates socialism, by example, publishing magazines, holding talks and debates, and recently, kind of making films and sort of making ourselves known on the internet. So in other words, there needs to be a party that puts forward the case for socialism and only for socialism in the kind of ideological sphere, if only just to keep the idea of socialism alive, which the party, to its credit, has done very successfully for over 100 years now. Three, there also needs to be a party that enters the political sphere. And one advantage, of course, of entering the political sphere is that we can use the platform given to us every time we stand someone for Parliament, to propagate socialism, to do, thing number two. But more importantly, when we have a socialist majority within the working class, the most democratic and the least bloodiest way of taking the state away from the ruling class is through the ballot. Anarchists obviously like to criticise us for this position, but when you get to the anarchist idea of dealing with the state, I think it soon becomes clear how kind of just fantastically suicidal it is. And I don't really have time to kind of go into the SPGB criticism of anarchism, but yeah, I believe in the principle of sending delegates to Parliament in order to wrestle state power from the camps of class. Number four, I also think it's vital that this party, the SPGB, is hostile to all other political parties and remains standing only for socialism. And this, I think, is because, in a way, the anarchists are right, and William Morris was right, that entering into the state is a very dangerous thing to do. It's less dangerous than all the other options, but I think to send delegates to Parliament, we shouldn't underestimate that's quite a risky and kind of problematic thing for the party to be trying to do. And the reason it's dangerous is because capitalism is just a dangerously malleable system, and it's brilliant at either kind of neutralising its enemies through brute force, as it has kind of done in the past, but really, like, what it's proven itself really good at is for kind of co-opting them under its wing, and making them part of its fabric and part of just a normal bourgeois political party. And history has just kind of proven this definitively. Parties that kind of enter the political sphere, attempting to be both revolutionary and reformist, invariably just end up being reformist. And that's true wherever you look. If you look at the ANC in South Africa, or if you look at the social democratic parties in Europe, or if you look at a lot of people in the early days of the Labour Party, some of which said, we believe in a moneyless, stateless society. Of course we do, but in the meantime we've got to try and be reformist. Invariably they end up just being reformist. So it's clear that a party seeking socialism has to be hostile to all other political parties. And this talk isn't a criticism of any of the activities I've just mentioned. So to recap quickly, in order to get socialism, one, we need a party that stands for socialism and only for socialism. Two, a party that campaigns and propagates socialism and only socialism in the kind of ideological sphere. And three, a party that seeks to be a vessel whereby the working class can use the kind of fairly limited democratic channels available to us in order to dispossess the capitalist class of the state and their monopoly on violence. And four, we've got to be hostile to all other political parties in our attempt to do this. But obviously, in this respect, I'm kind of preaching to the choir. So, and the purpose of this summer school is to kind of try and look at new perspectives of socialism, which is what I'm going to try and do. So what I want to ask is, well, what about the kind of non-political and ideological sphere? So what ought the party's attitude be, in particular, to trade unions? At the moment, I think the party kind of considers trade unions a necessary part of capitalism, and the way of defending workers. But I'm going to ask, can they ever be more than that? Can they ever have a transformative power in terms of getting rid of capitalism? So my main thesis is basically that there's kind of two sides to the coin. So on one hand, there needs to be a party that campaigns for socialism and only for socialism. And when we have a socialist majority, we need a party that enters the political sphere to take power from the capitalist class. But on the other hand, much of the struggle for socialism will take place outside of the ideological sphere and the parliamentary kind of political sphere, in trade unions, but not necessarily just trade unions. I think a lot of what I'm going to say would also apply to things like squatters groups and tenants associations, and other kind of organisations of working class power. And I think it's worth asking what these organisations will look like, what they're likely to look like as kind of socialism and socialist ideas develop. But more importantly, I think, what should they look like? What should we as socialists want to see these organisations look like? So during this talk, I'm going to argue kind of two things in regards to trade unions and what I'd call like class-wide unions. One is that the right form of trade union activity can and does lead to an increase in socialist ideas. And two, whatever our attitude to class-wide unionism might be, even when socialist ideas take hold amongst workers, I'd say it's likely, if not inevitable, that more democratic, radical and class-wide forms of trade unionism will emerge. And the party kind of already calls for more democracy in trade unions, but I'm going to argue that it ought to come out more explicitly in favour of industrial, even better, kind of class-wide unionism. An example would be along the lines of the IWW. And I don't know if everyone knows what the IWW is, but should I just say a bit about what the IWW is? So the IWW was formed, I think, at the beginning of the last century, and it was formed on the principle of leaderless organisation among the working class, having a class-wide trade union that isn't specific to workplaces, and doing what they kind of call building a future society in the kind of shell of the old. And I just want to kind of map out the kind of the sort of different party kind of camps on this issue, because I think the party kind of seems to be split into three loose camps on this. And kind of split might be a bit stronger word. I don't want to make out that there's sort of some big feud going on in the party, but I think it's kind of three sort of historical tendencies within the party. So you've got kind of camp one, and this was the kind of anti-trade union stance, or what I would call maybe the reluctancy stance. And I think this stance really kind of disappeared from the party when social studies split. And this stance kind of sort of reluctantly tolerates trade unions, but sees them at best as kind of a sort of needed thing within capitalism to defend workers, but at worst a kind of a form of reformism that acts as a distraction from creating socialists. And I'm not going to spend too much time arguing against this position, because I don't think it's one that anyone or many people in the party subscribe to now, although if you do, then you can obviously tell me about it later. And then camp two, I think you have the kind of majority party opinion, and this I think is the kind of official party stance, which is that trade unions are a necessary defence within capitalism. Workers therefore should organise into trade unions. They're not just kind of purely distractions, they are necessary. But no particular stance on the form of kind of unions workers should join, or any kind of particular stance on organisational questions. So it's kind of the general attitude, I think, in this camp is kind of, if you have a union in your workplace, yeah, of course you should join it, and you should campaign against it, being affiliated to the Labour Party, but don't kind of delude yourself into thinking trade unions are anything more than defences of workers within capitalism. And the exact way a kind of union is organised, what it does is kind of just really up to the kind of individual members to decide how best, and there shouldn't be a kind of party stance on it. And then you have kind of camp three, and for the sake of argument, we're going to call this tendency the kind of class struggle tendency, or the IWW tendency. And it's this tendency that I intend to argue for. And I don't claim to speak for any kind of individuals in the party on this, but just in kind of general conversations with the party, I've noticed that there's a few people that kind of tend to agree with me on this issue, and I thought, at least, you know, at the worst, I can just kind of bring attention to this and we can have a kind of discussion about it. So we would argue basically that trade unions can, in certain circumstances, have a transformative power. In other words, the kind of right sort of trade union can form part of the development of socialist ideas and can play a big part in the building of socialism. And in reverse, we'd say that with the development of social ideas will inevitably come the forming of what we call the right sort of trade unions. So this obviously just then begs the question, how best to define the right sort of trade unions from a socialist perspective. Obviously, I want to argue that some trade unions ought to be advocated by socialists over others. And this is obviously not just in terms of how we think they can kind of best defend their members within capitalism. For example, you know, we sort of tell them to disaffiliate from the Labour Party because it's impractical for a trade union to be affiliated to a party of capitalism. That's true. We should say that. But I don't think that's the only question is a kind of practical question of how best workers defend themselves in capitalism. The other question that I think we should be asking is how, which trade unions best advance the socialist cause, which I think they can, and some people probably think they can't, so you'll get your turn, don't worry. So here's a list of questions that I think socialists should ask when assessing the value of a particular trade union from the point of view of actually building socialism. This isn't necessarily just to do with trade unions, but any kind of working class organisation. So one question that I think we should ask is, to what extent does it empower the working class? So number one, does it operate on a leaderless basis? Number two, does it have a kind of fully democratic structure that allows its members to make direct decisions over the union and how the union should operate? Three, does it either in its kind of written constitution and propaganda or in its daily activities challenge not just capital by fighting for wage labour, you know, fair day's work for fair day's pay kind of thing, but capitalism, that's to say the mode of production, the social relation of capitalism. And this kind of may be quite a controversial one, but I think we should also ask how radical are not just its goals, but its actual actions. It's my view that as socialists we should support the sort of trade union action that involves not just kind of like legal strikes, but preferably things like workplace occupations, wildcat strikes, and other forms of direct action, which of course the problem is it means stepping outside of the kind of legal sphere. But don't worry about that, because the Tory party are going to make any form of trade union action illegal soon anyway, I should imagine so. And question number four I think we should ask is, to what extent does it organise on a class-wide basis? So does it encourage individualism by only organising in a particular workplace or trade, thus kind of disguising our identity as a class? Or does it call for unity of all workers in all industries, in all parts of the world? Now, there seems to be a kind of strange position amongst some people in the party, which is that the kind of like, the less radical union, the more it's seen as kind of acceptable for members of the SPGB to join. So for example, when the IWW decided to kind of emphasise less their whole abolish the wages system, build a new society in the shell of the old thing, in favour of just kind of, you know, they decided to emphasise that element of the propaganda less, in favour of just building a big union membership and just campaigning kind of in workplaces for you know, to build the union. I think that there was a kind of general feeling amongst a lot of people in the party that, well, now it's kind of okay to join because they are just like any other trade union, you know, they're just kind of defending themselves, they're just a normal trade union. And I think I might say that there's even a time in the party, you know, where you could kind of be kicked out for being a member of the IWW because it would be seen as, you know, you sided with the anarchists, that's it, you're no longer a true SPGBer. But now that, of course, the IWW, at least in its kind of propaganda, is less anarchist and more like a normal trade union, there's this actually, well, sure, you know, join the IWW, it's just a trade union. Well, I think this is madness, frankly. And the reason I think this, well, I want you to kind of ask yourself a question. Are the prospects for socialism more or less hopeful if A, we have however many kind of hundreds of thousands of workers are united around the principle of a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and also obviously a trade union that's affiliated to a bourgeois political party, the Labour Party, or B, if those workers are in a trade union like the IWW, which kind of might have some funny ideas about the state and some sort of strange anarchist ideas about how to deal with the state, and I think we're right to criticise it for that. But it believes in the abolition of the wages system, it believes in leaderless organisation, it believes in one union for the entire working class, and even if it isn't affiliated to any party, it doesn't support any political activity, at least it's not affiliated to the Labour Party. And obviously socialists can't, just kind of wave a magic wand and turn all the Unite membership into IWW members. And I'm not even saying that the party should necessarily change its kind of official stance on this, but I would argue that as socialists, as members of the Social Party of Great Britain, as individual workers, we can kind of push things in the way that we want to see them in terms of trade union activity, and that in doing so we will be advancing the socialist cause. And I'm going to kind of preempt a party criticism here that I've kind of heard a lot and read a lot in the kind of Socialist Standard. So sometimes when you kind of press party members on this, I've noticed that they say, well, trade unions, when we say, our group says, well, trade unions don't just operate to negotiate a fair day's pay, but can play a part in abolishing the wages system. There's this kind of argument of the party, well, they say like, yes, of course they can, but then they are no longer trade unions. But this to me is just kind of word games, really. Like, because obviously, if you define a union as not just a body, as a body that just kind of negotiates for wages within capitalism, then it follows that as soon as it stops doing this, and it's therefore no longer a trade union. Fine, okay. But in my opinion, we kind of need to approach the question a bit more dialectically. The way I need to define dialectically. Or maybe I could just say it's kind of reciprocally. So of course most trade unions at present are at best purely defensive measures. But this says nothing about how trade unions should be, or how trade unions might become as hopefully we see, a growth in socialist ideas amongst the working class. So you kind of know what I'm arguing for. So I better start backing some of it up there, I guess. So one thing I just draw upon, I suppose, is personal experience. So I used to work at a restaurant called Ask, which is, some of you might have heard of it, it's a chain Italian restaurant, rather horrible chain Italian restaurant. It's all oil in the bag, kind of bolognese, and I was supposedly a chef, but I don't really consider that chefing. And we had pretty shit working conditions. We were all the people in the kitchen pretty much on the minimum wage, and all the front of house staff were really kind of screwed over by the bosses. And so we decided to kind of fight back and form a trade union. I kind of encouraged a lot of people in my workplace to try and get in a union. So one night we kind of all went off to the pub and we decided to form a union. As it happens, it's quite, I may as well just spoil the end. It's a pretty dire story. I ended up not being called in again when I wanted, so and the boss found out. And yeah, he kind of couldn't sack me, but I just didn't get called in again. There you go. Lots of the staff are now unionised, so there's sort of a bit of a silver lining. But there's something in kind of meeting up with fellow workers to discuss how to fight back that felt empowering, and I think was empowering. And so for the first time, kind of since working at that place, I felt a sense of community. And organising kind of like that without leaders for yourself, I think it's important to understand, is a form of unalienated activity. And there's a quote from Marx now that I want to read. And when I read this quote, I kind of read this quote after I was a communist before I tried to form this union. Part of the reason I tried to form the union, but I read this quote afterwards from Marx, and it kind of made a lot of sense to me. Yeah, and you have to excuse the use of the word man here. It's Karl Marx, it was the Victorian times, what can I say? But anyway, Marx in the 1844 manuscripts says, when communist workmen gather together, their immediate aim is instruction, propaganda, etc. But at the same time they acquire a new need, the need for society, and what appears as a means has become an end. This practical development could be most strikingly observed in the gatherings of French socialist workers. Smoking, eating and drinking, etc. are no longer means of creating links between people. Company, association, conversation which in turn has society as its goal, is enough for them. The brotherhood of man is not just a hollow phrase, it is a reality, and the nobility of man shines forth upon us from the work-born figures. And obviously, you know, Marx here is talking about kind of already class-conscious workers. But I think that kind of all forms of the right kind of working class organisation, leaderless organisation, where workers get together for themselves in a kind of, you know, not in a top-down way, is a form of kind of unalienated activity that gives people a glimpse of what a future socialist society might look like. And I think the question, I'm not going to go too far down the kind of road of alienation, but I think one of the things about alienation is that it's a really difficult thing to conceptualise from the perspective of capitalism. It's really hard to imagine what an unalienated world might look like. One of the arguments I'd say in favour of socialists forming these sort of trade unions is that they'll give us a kind of glimpse of unalienated social labour. And this is something that I think kind of socialists can disagree on. I'm also not saying that anyone is a bad socialist for not doing this. You know, if you have a kind of family to feed and a job to keep, then you may well choose to stick to traditional SPGB activity. And it's also, of course, true that there's a whole kind of branch of the working class that, for whatever reason, aren't in employment, you know, because they're retired or disabled or because they're just unemployed, you know. And I think a question facing a group like the IWW is how best to kind of get these people into the kind of fold of this class-wide activity. And I'm not saying that any of the activity that the SPGB does is any less vital to socialism. So I'm not saying that, you know, like propagating socialism, standing for, you know, in Parliament, all that stuff. I'm not saying it's kind of it's lesser activity because it's not direct action. You know, I think anarchists like to kind of lead on about direct action, but it's a bit kind of like sort of, you know, like kind of manicism, you know, the kind of shit like, you know, oh, we're getting the goods kind of thing. I'm not kind of saying that. You know, I think that everything, as I say, the party does, it should do. All I'm saying is that kind of forming the right sort of trade unions or the right sort of working class organisations can have a transformative power in terms of getting rid of capitalism. The other reason I'd argue this is a question of normalisation. So the SPGB stance that the battle of ideas needs to be fought is correct, but I'd also argue that part of the way capitalism keeps its ideas as the dominant ideas is by normalising itself. And it is this normalisation that we need to fight, because it kind of gives the impression that there's no conflict in our society in a few ways. It's got a few kind of tricks up its sleeve for doing this. One way is nationalism. You know, the idea of that workers kind of have more in common with the power side class of their own country than they do with their fellow workers abroad. I think a class-wide trade union internationally could do a lot to kind of dispel nationalism, and in dispelling nationalism amongst workers, when socialists then come along and make the international case, we're going to have more of a receptive audience to it. Another way is kind of it's just through culture in general, really, and in particular art. You know, I think that's another way that the capitalist class kind of normalises itself. There's an art critic called Stuart Home. He talks a lot about kind of how art serves as a sort of cultural glue to unify the capitalists and working class around kind of like universal values of kind of beauty and aesthetics. I won't go too far into Stuart Home stuff, it's all a bit waffly. And democracy as well is another way that we, you know, they give this idea of the kind of things in capitalism are kind of normal and fair and everything's all right, you know, or the kind of illusion of democracy. And the other way that I think they just normalise stuff is just through kind of seemingly harmonious financial transactions, like the buying and selling of wage labour, paying rent. As long as these kind of activities can be seen as just kind of like the normal day-to-day things, or just, you know, it's a natural thing that all human beings do, sell their labour to survive, then, you know, we're in trouble. And what I argue is that when people form trade unions and occupy their workplaces, or when they squat a building, it serves to denormalise capitalism. So direct action reveals the holes and contradictions in the system, and in doing so kind of denormalises it, makes it so that it becomes kind of at odds with itself. You know, for example, that nothing, I don't think, exposed the insanity of capitalism more than the sight of squatters being evicted by the police to keep a house empty in a society with mass homelessness. You know, we've got tons of unemployed people, tons of empty homes and tons of homeless people, and meanwhile squatters that are going in, forming squatters organisations, doing up houses, putting them to use, are getting beaten up by cops and dragged out. Nothing, I don't think, can kind of like, however many socialist standards we publish, nothing can kind of really reveal the absurdity and the sight of that happening. And as socialists, we feed off this sort of action. Every time there's a strike or violent protest, we correctly kind of use it as an opportunity to make our case. Yet for some reason we don't seem to want to do any of this ourselves a lot of the time. And yeah, the way we direct our propaganda, I think, indicates that we do kind of see some sort of value in this. So I kind of just want you to kind of imagine if we did live in a form of capitalism in which there were no strikes, there was no conflict, because everything was just kind of kindly negotiated peacefully between the capitalist class and the workers through kind of trade union bosses. This is a sort of, it's maybe a little bit unfair to call it the German model, but it's quite a popular model, I think, amongst the European Union establishment, which is, where you have the trade union bosses and the parasite class every year get together and say, right, how are the working class going to be exploited next year? Let's decide and let's negotiate, and we can avoid all the kind of striking stuff. I think if workers can wrestle back control of the trade union movement to ourselves and organise for ourselves and fuck off these overpaid, to the overpaid kind of trade union bosses, we're in a better position. I'd say that it'd be much harder for the SPGB to put its case if we have a kind of normalised form of capitalism, because the kind of contradiction of capitalism are less identifiable. So in this sense, we just rest on the class struggle, I think. And whilst we kind of like tend to dismiss a lot of it as kind of like reformist, I'd want to make a distinction between reformism, that is to say, top-down organisation seizing power of the state as a thing that I think we rightly oppose, and direct action, leaderless action on behalf of the working class in our own communities, in our own workplaces. And as Marx says, it's our job, I'm going to massively get this quite wrong, but it's our job to get workers to take off their banners, a fair day's pay for a fair day's wage, and instead inscribe upon their banners the revolutionary war for the abolition of the wages system. How much time have I got? I might just end it there.
Plenty of time.
So I've got kind of footnote as well. So that's the talk. I've got a footnote. So I mentioned kind of that one of the ways capitalism kind of normalises itself is through democracy, or what I prefer to call the kind of illusion of democracy. And I'd be interested to kind of pose another sort of final question, which is, how much do we actually believe in democracy or in the democratic legitimacy of Parliament? In other words, is it kind of the illusion of democratic legitimacy, or is it an actual legitimate thing in itself? I think it's an important question that we kind of sometimes overlook. If we really believe that democracy as it currently stands is legitimate, then not only should people not be doing the sort of direct action I propose, but they shouldn't even be striking, right? So the Tory government won a majority in Parliament. If Parliament is legitimate, therefore it follows that they have a legitimate democratic mandate. Strikes, therefore, by individual workers, in the NHS and schools, etc., opposing the cuts are therefore illegitimate. Of course, this isn't what we believe. No one in the party argues this. We do believe that individual groups of workers should strike against democratically elected governments. But this, I think we should be honest about what this is. This is putting the class struggle and working class democracy before the kind of democratic decisions of the nation, which is no bad thing in my opinion. And I think it's possible to do this whilst also saying the safest possible thing we can do when we have a socialist majority is to send delegates to Parliament. I don't think that there's as much of a contradiction between the kind of what you might call the anarchist position and the socialist position. I think it's possible for us to say, yeah, we should be forming different forms of democratic decision making in workplaces, but we should also, in the long run, play the bourgeoisie at their own game, basically say, oh, we live in a democracy, now we're going to send delegates to Parliament, we're going to dismantle capitalism. How do you like that? And the anarchists might be right. The anarchists might be right that the bourgeoisie turn around and say, well, stuff you, we're going to open fire on a lot of you, we're going to storm into Parliament and shoot all your delegates. We don't know, they might be right. But the question I'd ask to the anarchists is, in what situation are you going to have more kind of undecided members of the armed forces and members of the police force coming over to our side, in a situation where we've at least tried to do it peacefully and democratically and through the state at first, or in a situation where we've just screwed that off altogether and thought, set up the barricades, kind of, this romantic anarchist bollocks. And finally, so we claim that Parliament won't be used as some sort of central decision-making force. So when the anarchists kind of criticise us and say, what are you talking about going to the state? How can you claim to be for the working class if you believe in sending delegates to Parliament? We say, and I think it's true, that the Parliament won't be a central decision-making force. The delegates will only go with the aim of abolishing Parliament and bourgeois property rights itself, and of just simply taking the power of the capitalist class away from the capitalist class, so that the individual actions or the actions of the working class in our workplaces and communities of building socialism can happen. But I think as this kind of develops, socialists should make use of the kind of IWW phrase, that we build a new society out of the shell of the old. I think that this is what the Socialist Party position would have to imply. And obviously, as I say, where the IWW go wrong is kind of in ignoring the need to use things like Parliament at all. But as socialists, I think we really need to kind of think about how workplaces are going to be transformed. It's a really kind of difficult task, and it's a difficult task not just because of the kind of logistics of what the capitalist class might do, but I think it's also really difficult just from a kind of interpersonal level. I mean, if you think about it, like presumably some of you have bosses. You go in, as the socialist ideas start to develop, you go in and you start saying to your boss, right, we're going to take over the means of production. Your boss is going to immediately just resist you just on a kind of personal level. And I think that the IWW principle of trying to kind of like build workplace democracy, build a kind of structure that can actually transform each workplace on a kind of class-wide basis, it's not to be kind of sneezed at. Just let me review. Yes, and given that kind of we in the Socialist Party place socialism as our sole and immediate aim, and we're right to do that, I think therefore follows that that kind of sending to delegates is our immediate aim. You can't kind of like say, let me phrase this right. So if you say that what is required in order to bring about socialism is the sending of delegates to Parliament, and if you also say that we as a party believe in the immediate establishment of socialism and the workers should immediately establish socialism, then it follows that we want to do this stuff immediately. And if we do, then why don't we also advocate for forms of workers-run trade unions that don't just kind of negotiate for better pay, but have as their goal the ultimate kind of abolition of the wages system. And I don't really want to kind of give a caricature of the SPGB. The SPGB kind of always has been, I think, more open to ideas around kind of workers' councils, industrial unionism than anarchists make out. But I do think that we should kind of just clarify our position on this. And I think the best way of doing that is just to kind of, just open it up to the floor now. And you can say what you think. But yeah, there you go. Thanks.
Is there a question? Is there a question, please?
Yeah, thanks, John. I've got two questions. I think I know the
Could you
answer.
speak up?
Sorry,
Everyone.
sorry, Comrade. I've got two questions. I think I know the answer. I think I know the answer to the first one. I'd like you just to confirm that, because I think in two respects, when you argue for leaderless unions and for unions that are not affiliated to reformist political parties, I agree with those claims, because I think having unions with leaders and having unions affiliated to the Labour Party is bad for the workers, because I think it's bad for trade unionism, and having unions that are leaderless and unions that are not affiliated to the Labour Party will both make them more successful, which will benefit the working class, and also is more likely to encourage people to be more autonomous in their thinking, that they can actually organise themselves. and therefore we can organise a future society without leaders and without bosses, and without a ruling class. But I'm a bit unclear as whether you're advocating that we should seek to argue that the existing trade unions should go down that road, or whether we should organise unions who go down that road in opposition to the existing trade unions. But I'm a bit more wanting it, I think I know the answer, but when I'm a bit more confused is when you're saying that we should advocate workplace organisations that should be mounting campaigns to occupy the workplaces and organise wildcat strikes. Well, in the absence of a majority of workers who are ready for a social revolution, where do you think these actions will lead to? What are workers going to be achieving in those actions if it's not just, defending their immediate position or gaining a wage rise or a better working conditions at the time?
Okay. Yeah. So in regards to your first question, should we organise new trade unions? I think in a way this is it's just a kind of practical question. We accept the proposition that what's needed is a class-wide trade union. It should be a leaderless trade union. It should be an international trade union. One trade union for workers. There's a kind of question of do we we work within Unite, for example, to try and turn Unite around so that it disaffiliates itself from the Labour Party, there's more power amongst the membership, and not to kind of parasite Leninists, kind of run the whole thing. That's just kind of practical, and it's not necessarily one I've really got the answer to. My inclination would be that, one of the problems, of course, is that, when you start in a workplace, you're a teacher, okay? The only union you've got is the National Union of Teachers. So it's kind of all very well saying, like, well, each worker does this, but, as an individual worker, you've just got the union that you've got. I don't think that individual workers shouldn't be in the NUT. I think they should try to democratise the NUT and do all the things that I'm trying to transform the NUT if they can. But what might be the solution is some sort of dual cards thing, which is what the IWW advocate. So you join the NUT, but you also join the IWW, and you also maybe use like the failures of the NUT or the leadership of the NUT or its affiliation to the Labour Party to kind of encourage workers in your workplace to join the IWW. And when you have enough workers that are prepared to join the IWW, you discard the NUT altogether. Or it might be that you kind of manage to transform the NUT in such a way where it can kind of join the IWW and disaffiliate from the Labour Party. That might be possible. It's a practical question. I don't really have the answer, but yeah, I mean, it strikes me as am I right in thinking it's a question of practice and not really of principle? And then your second question is, should workers occupy their workplaces? And I suppose what you're trying to kind of tease out here is, am I kind of advocating a sort of anarcho-syndicalist proposition here? Well, in a way, I think I probably am. Yeah, because I think I'm saying that. I mean, you're right, and I think it's another practical question that a lot of workers might be quite screwed if they start trying to do this. If you walk in, let's say a fish factory down Hessel Road in Hull decides, right, we're going to take over the fish factory and we're going to own it all ourselves. There's lots of practical questions. For a start, are you kind of trying to abolish money in this, or are you kind of setting up as a workers' co-op, or what are you going to do when the cops come around? This is all true. And these are big holes in the kind of anarcho-syndicalist idea, and I think that's why everything that the SPGB advocates is good. But the question is whether workers should kind of do it anyway, and kind of maybe lose the battle but win the war by doing this kind of thing. Should we as workers advocate for this, advocate for the most radical option in order to kind of radicalise the working class, in order to make the most kind of extreme demands? And in doing so, we kind of actually in a weird way put ourselves in a better bargaining position against the capitalist class anyway. If you're a boss is going to take a workplace much more seriously if they're saying ultimately we want to get rid of you, so you better play nice. We're going to rather than just saying like, oh, can we just get a kind of a better pay? And I think it puts workers, just from a practical point of view, in a better position. And I also I think that ultimately in doing forms of direct action like wildcat strikes and occupying workplaces, it can serve to radicalise workers, and it can also serve to kind of to denormalise capitalism, to make it so that capitalism the rules of capitalism. The capital class own the means of production, and the workers don't. And these are the rules, of course. This is the reason socialists criticise trade unions, because trade unions accept this basic proposition. Trade unions exist to accept this proposition that it's the capital class own, and the workers sell their labour, and it's just a negotiating position. But that doesn't mean that that's all what trade unions can or should be. And I think that we should consider, advocating trade unions to be more than that. But I accept that there's a lot of practical problems with, just suddenly occupying your own workplace.
I was going to ask a question that when, and I think you've already answered it by the way, that when you were in that particular position when you were telling the people, your fellow workers, to join a union, you weren't actually asking to join the IBWW, you were actually asking to join a union that was actually negotiating for that particular group of workers. And that's really the whole point about the situation if you're going to start talking about unions in the first place. Because I have experience in a trade union. I joined a trade union when I was just coming up from 15, and I'm still in the trade union yet. But I've been through different trade unions in the process. Using the Scottish painters, then it became Scottish painters and the woodworkers in England, then it became eventually the UCAT. And of course, UCAT's in a situation now where they're paying off some of their particular delegates because the money's right down, because the union membership's right down, and that type of thing. But my experience anyway in trade unions is that you're limited about what you can do anyway just by dealing with the actual agreements as they arrive. And there's, listen, I never ever negotiated wages, because the wages in the building industry were always negotiated higher up. What you got was the result of it, And of course, you also got the result of the discussions that took place higher up, and that was your working conditions and so on. And so most of your work in that particular area could only take place, obviously, with what was in the rule book, because if you're going to have a case for anybody, you could only apply to that particular agreement and either argue that they're breaking it and so on, and you either won or lost based on that particular proposition. So, and again, sort of building up a union, the situation at the moment in a lot of situations is that, and it happened when I was working as well, because I was eventually one of them that took my redundancy. When a situation came along where it was redundant, workers were quite happy to get out with, as long as they got a package that's going to suit them. And that's one of the situations in just now. What you have with a lot of trade unions, with 2 million members or something like that, but they've amalgamated more and more different groups of workers into it. I know that gets nearer this idea of yourself about an international work, the workers, because that's basically what we are, a group of workers. And we obviously just need a union that's going to fight in the sense of everything that we need. But the situation is moving at the moment. The unions are getting bigger, but and you've already hinted on it yourself about where you have this level of trade unionists who deal with all types of workers, because they're taking all types of workers in now into the union. So they're already ahead of yourself. The idea of having all the workers here, they're ahead of you in that sense. So we're actually drawing all the workers in just now and then negotiate for all the workers. So really, where is the fight going to take place? Is it going to take place actually in the union, or is it going to take place outside the union, in the sense where union workers is going to say, wait a minute, we have a structure here, that obviously we know, because we can't get into it, because we can't get past this level. So, it's going to be very difficult in that sense. How do you break this? They are at the top, they are already in this level that you're looking for, but they've got it. So I don't see how you can do it any more than do it the way we do it in arguing the socialist case. That we have to argue as a socialist case point that we can have a better world, but at the same time, we can only point out that a trade union job is just merely to settle a wage for you, and that's what we have to get rid of, is a wage. Get a different type of society without wages.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I agree, yeah, I agree with everything you said about the analysis of the situation of unions as they stand and the problems in trying to do what I'm doing. Maybe I'm missing the point, but is it, what would be the question there then? What would be...
Well, I was a wee bit doubtful of first, you obviously were answering it in the sense that you were saying you were going to build this sort of IWW, but I don't see that building an IWW is going to be, not against getting that particular object that you're talking about, but I don't think you're going to get it that way, because I kind of see you breaking the system where you can only get your complaint through any particular union. The point I was trying to make was that, and you always answer, if you were trying to solve a problem just now at local level, you can only do it through the group who have access to the employers, and with the agreements and so on with these employers. And that, so therefore, you can only reinforce that particular group by getting more of them into it. Because you're going to make the union stronger by bringing more folk in. But that's why I'm saying that you're not really going to break anybody away. Because if we're going to get their answers that way, that's where they'll go.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Well, I think, I think I take your point, but I think one of the arguments against that is that unions as they stand are kind of just really lacking, even from the basic job that they're supposed to do, right? Of just, the fair days, pay for fair days work kind of stuff. And even on that level, I think unions are really lacking. They're lacking because there's all sorts of deals that go on with the union bosses and the workplace, that the workplace often don't agree on. There's all sorts of instances of the workplace, of the union membership being against the leadership of the union, because the union leadership kind of agree to something with the workplace and say, oh, hold on a minute, this isn't what we agreed to. And they're also affiliated to the Labour Party, and the Labour Party, every time it comes into power, whether it's Tony Blair or whether Jeremy Corbyn gets into power, it's going to have to do what capitalist parties have to do, and that's screw over the working class, And so my hope is that in the kind of process of this happening, within the trade union movement, we can kind of persuade workers that either, we need to transform these kind of trade unions like Unite, affiliate to bourgeois political parties, and stop that happening and take that power into the kind of grassroots trade unions, or we need to form the IWW. I think if the trade unions prove themselves not to be malleable in this respect, and if we can get workers, this is why I still believe in the role of the SPGB in terms of getting workers to just demand more than this. If we can get workers to demand more than this, and then trade unions like Unite can prove to be unmalleable, then I think we will see a situation in which workers need to form the IWW or get into other organisations. But I admit that it's a problem. Yeah. But no, it's true. Yeah, but it's there's all sorts of practical questions just for the Socialist Party, and there's also practical questions for the sort of thing that I'm advocating as well. And it's an upward battle.
Yeah, thanks, Johnny. I really enjoyed that. Yeah. Like you, I've come across members of the party who are in Camp 1, and I've been horrified to hear anti-trade union rhetoric from members of a supposedly socialist party. So I'm definitely in Camp 2. I'm emerging into Camp 3 with you, Johnny. I wanted to say that at the outset. What else? I've got a few points to make and probably a question for you as well. I'm a member of the CWU, Communications Workers Union, but I also joined the IWW in early 2013, so I'm paying 2 lots of trade union subscriptions. I actually did a talk on trade unions at the West London branch in 2013, and actually brought along the IWW membership book, the rule book, and when I got the membership book, I was actually surprised. Well, I'm not sure I was surprised because I'd obviously done the research first, and he's quoting from Marx at the end of Value, Price and Profit. And I thought, hang on a minute, this is exactly what we say in our declaration, but it's what we stand for, the abolition of the wages system. So I wanted to mention that. So I mentioned the IWW, and I understand the socialist criticism of the IWW, that it's based on sectional interests of the society and not society as a whole. I also understand that trade unions fail when they collaborate with governments or collaborate with the political parties, i.e. trade unions and the Labour government in the 60s and 70s, you know, failing in their actual duty by allying themselves with a bourgeois government. And also the political levy to the Labour Party, don't support that at all as a member of the Socialist Party of Great Britain. And what it's led me to think in recent years is like, well, if the SPGB is a political party, we should accept a political levy from members of the IWW because, like I say, the rule book says the same as like what we believe in as well. One other thing, I mean, Lenin said that trade union consciousness was the only level that the working class could actually reach. Now, with the attacks on trade unions in the 80s, 90s, and this year already, Sajid David is already saying like there's going to be further restrictions. I mean, what do you think? I mean, the working class are not even going to be able to develop trade union consciousness because trade unions will become almost illegal. Again, yeah, thanks, Johnny. I enjoyed your talk. Any comments on that?
Yeah, well, for that, I mean, yeah, I think if the IWW wanted to start paying political dues to the SPGB, that would be a good thing. Yeah, of course. I mean, obviously we've got a real fight on our hands there, kind of like, you know, the battle over ideas really with the anarchists in terms of, you know, what to actually do about the state ultimately, and then persuading them that there is a need for a political element to this. You know, there will ultimately be the need to deal with the state in some sort of way, and that the best way of doing that is by some delegates to Parliament. Yeah, I mean, we can have that discourse. I think we can have that discourse with anarchists best by joining the IWW and by saying, you know, like, yeah, there's some really good things about the IWW. You're right that there's flaws in the IWW, other flaws in the IWW in terms of sort of sectional interest, but the IWW is a pretty good starting point, I think. And by joining the IWW, we can kind of, you know, we can have that discourse as kind of fellow workers, as fellow members of the same trade union, and say, well, look, you know, you've still got this question of what you're going to do about the state. Yeah, so I agree with that. And in terms of, what was the other stuff to do with?
Level of consciousness, Lenin's comments.
Yeah, sure, yeah. So in terms of Lenin, I mean, yeah, well, obviously I don't subscribe to Lenin's opinion that workers can only achieve socialist consciousness. I think, yeah, but you don't either, so I wouldn't argue against that. Yeah, and sorry, and you also mentioned about the, you know, trade unionism just becoming illegal. Well, I think this can only be a good thing for organisations like the IWW. You know, you see all the time. You know, the problem with the mainstream trade unions is that they're affiliated to the Labour Party. The Labour Party want to be a kind of respectable party, you know, respectable kind of face to Middle England, kind of whatever Middle England's supposed to be. Just a section of the working class that don't realise they're the working class, really. But anyway, you know. So whenever it comes to, you know, when it comes to the kind of the Tory measures against trade unions, the Labour Party are going to basically be saying, yeah, don't break the law.